First to the U.S. state of Tennessee, where the Department of Education has issued proposed guidance related to a new censorship law which aims to regulate discussions on topics of race and gender in the classroom. School districts who violate the state's new law could be fined anything from $1 to $5 million anytime a teacher knowingly transgresses the guidelines. Educators may also have their teaching licenses suspended or revoked. It's all about something that's been shrouded under the misleading label of critical race theory that involves the teaching of things like America's history of slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, and the civil rights movement. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by Arise correspondent Itoro Udofia, who spent many years as a writer and teacher in the United States. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
So tell us more about this new guidance, because Tennessee was one of the first states in the US to pass a law restricting how teachers can talk in classrooms about systemic racism, about white privilege, and about sexism, basically.
Exactly. And this new guidance, it's an 11-page guideline, and it basically clarifies what can be taught, what can't be taught, and how to navigate this ban. So some of the things that are on the guidelines include you can't teach that one race is superior from another. And another thing is also that you can have impartial discussions on controversial aspects of that history, but it has to be impartial.
You can or you can't?
You can.
Okay,
you can,
right, you
but
can
it has to be impartial.
Right,
so that's
okay.
why I'm doubling down on who defines impartiality.
That's a very good point. And what makes this Tennessee law unique? I mean, we'll get to talk about the nitty-gritty of that critical race theory, but what makes this Tennessee law unique is the financial consequences of school districts violating the law, because every violation, or for every violation, I mean, school districts could lose up to $1 million, which is a heck of a lot of money.
Very true. And just looking at the numbers, for the first violation, if the department can withhold 2% of annual state funds for $1 million, and for the second, the department can withhold 4% of annual state funds or $2 million. So, you know, the more violations you accrue, the higher the bill gets. So definitely other states are also following suits with attaching financial consequences to teaching critical race theory.
I mean, we're going to get to talk about that because obviously it's quite controversial, but how is it possible that a state in the US can be talking about what some would argue is a very revisionist policy? I mean, it's almost like rewriting history, isn't it?
It is, and I mean, the thing is that these debates have been going on for a very long time. We're just seeing it in a very interesting way manifest now. What's interesting about CRT, it was a legal, academic framework developed by legal scholars to talk about racism beyond the individual, to talk about how it affects policy and the institutions we're in. So this is really about a question of ideology, because the way some people are looking at it, they're looking at it from an individual stance. Like, if I'm coming into a situation, I as an individual am not racist, whereas other people are looking at it from policy, from legacy,
systemic
from
racism.
Systemic racism.
Right.
So if we even take a look at Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and how he's looking at this right now, we'll see that he's coming from a very different ideological stance.
Very interesting. And Tennessee is far from alone, as you said, in trying to restrict how teachers talk to students about racism and race in America, because I understand that more than half the states are considering similar laws. You touched on that briefly, and 11 states have already passed these laws that aim to restrict how conversations about race are held in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, if we look, and it's happening, I have to say, everywhere, Midwest, New England, wherever you go, there are states pushing for this ban. We have Utah, the State Board of Education. They've just approved a new rule, and they did that in June. We have Pennsylvania, Idaho, Texas, Maine. So this is definitely a part of a big discourse, a larger discourse to say, we don't want this in our school districts, and this is how we're going to make it a point of policy.
Right, and we have a clip from the Georgia governor, don't we?
We do. So let's
take a listen to that.
They need to learn factual history, and they don't need to be indoctrinated. And I've talked to enough people to know that there are people that are out there that are trying to, educators that are out there trying to, you know, I think in my mind, wrongly influence our young people. And I've seen that firsthand myself. I don't think there's a place for that in education. I think we can teach history. I've always agreed with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. We can't run from our history. We have to learn from it, embrace it, and be better for it in the future. So I certainly think there's definitely a place for that, but it needs to be truthful history and not somebody's political agenda.
So you see how he's coming from a very particular stance. And if we look at Professor of Education from UC Berkeley, Prudence Carter, and how she sees it as a way of us just to confront a very troubled past and to also change a reality that many people are in, we'll see like the clashes that are happening. So let's play that.
Well, I hear people talking about critical race theory. I see that as a straw man for many communities, politicians particularly, trying to shape the knowledge base and what we teach students. I think that there is some fear about raising consciousness about structural inequality, about structural racism, because it does implicate many of our practices in our society. It indicates what we would have to do differently in government. And some of that is ideological in terms of there's a lot of resistance to how we do things to be fairer and more just in our society.
And the interesting thing too is that we're talking about K through 12 education. So this isn't about you being a college student, maybe getting to pick or choose the classes you want to be in. This is about something that'll be in all curriculum wherever you go. And that's why it's such a hot debate.
Absolutely. And all this was started by an executive order that was signed by former President Donald Trump. But that order has since been rescinded by the Biden administration, but that has led to a statewide push. And of course, a majority of the states that the law has been passed in are under Republican control, aren't they?
It's true, mostly. I mean, Byron Donalds, he's a Republican congressman from Florida, and he expressed the importance of teaching the full history, but being careful about the approach. So this is about how that history is taught and who it offends.
Very interesting. And so now how Americans talk about race in school has clearly been politicized. That's bound to make students of color suffer because, I mean, their teachers can't talk to them about truthful history, can they?
I mean, it's true. And the other thing, too, is that this is rolling back the gains that many Black teachers, Indigenous teachers, teachers of color have made to just get not only critical race theory, which is a catch-all phrase for a lot of things, but ethnic studies, labor studies, gender studies into the classroom. And it was really a way to protect students and teachers of color who are going into systems and into school districts that often don't want to teach this history and are often hurting them at the same time. So it was meant to provide tools to teach students how to think critically about the worlds they're in and how to change it.
So, I mean, has there been pushback to these rulings from the Black and Latino communities, from the teachers and from the education authorities challenging these rulings? I mean, you were a teacher in America. What's been the reaction?
I can definitely say that there's pushback, and the thing is that there's always been pushback. I can think back to 2010 in Arizona with the ethnic studies ban in K through 12 schools, and the Latino communities really coming out and saying we need this in our schools, we need this discourse. And then I also think of the Black Teacher Project.
But did they win in that instance?
They didn't win in that instance, but here I think we need to look at how we look at failure and success. And with movements like this, the success is actually in keeping going on. You don't stop the fight just because you have blowback. And I think you can see that with a lot of the educators. I think of the Black Teacher Project project. They've been in existence for now 5 years, and they're talking about the need for spaces where Black teachers are supported along with Black students, and they've been pushing and making those gains, and it's been a slow process. But because they're having those conversations, when stuff like this happens, we're much better prepared.
So, I mean, we've still got like a minute and a half before we have to end the chat. Could this end up in court? Might there be a push to contest this in court?
Oh, for sure. And especially with what's happening with Texas teachers, I think they came out with an article speaking about it. I can definitely see them taking this to court because now this has become officially a political issue. If you ever had any doubt about it, it's political now. And we're going to be using the legislative hall to figure that out as we're trying to figure it out on the ground.
Right, because of course you had, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, you had the Biden administration rescinding that executive order by Donald Trump, but I mean, clearly that hasn't made much of a difference, has it?
True, and I think this is interesting because you see what states do, what the federal government can do, and how people can move on their own accord. So we're seeing a true ideological battle right now.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's also a look at the American political system, isn't it? The way democracy works in America, because there are limits to what the federal government can and cannot do.
Very true.
And to that extent, that's a great education for the rest of the world. I mean, beyond the fact that this is a fairly controversial issue.
I would agree. I would definitely agree with that. And I think we'll definitely see what's to come from this and how even this particular historical moment is studied in the future.
Fascinating. Itoro, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for bringing that story to us. Itoro Udofia is a RISE correspondent who was a teacher in the United States.